study the female reproductive system, the first few slides, they're going to talk about the structure of the reproductive system. So female reproductive system has like two ovaries, two fallopian tube. Those fallopian tubes are not physically connected to the ovaries. They're hanging on top of the ovary where they can scoop up the ovulated egg and then can help in fertilization. Once the egg is fertilized, they can roll down that fallopian tube, come to the uterus. So uterus is a structure where implantation can take place, so they can support the growth of the fetus. And the vagina is the outer part of that, which can help receiving the sperm from the male body. So, and there are some few external genitalia. You can easily read that, as well as the one secondary structure that you have to read is the mammary gland or breast that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so this particular structure can help you to learn all the terminology. I think this one is better picture. It's basically the all same thing. So when you go there in the beginning, I wrote down that ovary, this one is the ovary. So there are two ovaries which are not physically connected to the fallopian tube. But that doesn't mean they're like hanging there. That doesn't mean they're hanging just in the air. They are supported by ligaments. These are the three ligaments that you are going to know: ovarian, suspensory, mesovarium. By the way, there are some other ligaments as well. So, but these three are good enough: ovarian, suspensory, and mesovarium. Mesovarium is the back ligament. Ovarian is this ligament, and suspensory is coming from the top. Suspensory ligament that is keeping this ovary right in that place. Okay. Now, this is the fallopian tube. Same thing on this side, fallopian tube. That fallopian tube sometimes also called uterine tube. So uterine tube or fallopian tube, where the fertilization takes place. Fertilization takes place somewhere here. Then they roll down the fertilized egg and implant on the wall of the uterus. So that's the uterus. So opening of the uterus is that this area is called cervix. The word cervix means neck. So that neck area, and that's the vagina, the external part that outside of the uterus that receive the sperm. So if we go right here, this structure will explain a little bit better. So this is the ovary, ovarian ligament here, suspensory is this side. These are called finger-like extension or fimbri. They are literally hanging on top of the ovary like this. So they have a, when the ovulation happens, the egg is ejected from the ovary due to chemotaxis, like some chemicals. They literally scoop up those eggs inside here. And this cell lining here, they have cilia, and those cilia are like beating in one direction from this way to the uterus, that direction. So they're the egg with all the follicle cells that I mentioned, all the guarding cells that I mentioned, they're rolling down here. And in the meantime, if the sperm can move from vagina, the cervix, to the uterus to right here, they can fertilize the egg. So fertilization takes place right over here. Then the fertilized egg takes approximately like 7 days to come and implant over here. Why it is so important? That is why whenever egg is maturing in the ovary, whenever, pay attention to this one, whenever egg is maturing in the ovary, at the same time, nature prepare the bed and the uterus for that growing embryo, because they don't know which egg is going to be fertilized and when. It's a random selections. So obviously every single cycle, when they make the egg, when they're maturing the egg and ovulated the egg into the fallopian tube, they also prepare the bed. Now, two things can happen. Either the egg gets fertilized or there is no fertilization. Maybe there is no sperm. So if the egg gets fertilized, the story will be different, because then the fertilized egg will implant here and continue to grow. If it does not get fertilized, then the egg will wash out from the body along with this layer of the uterus will also wash out. That part is known as menstrual flow, and which is the beginning of the menstrual cycle. The whole cycle is known as menstrual cycle. So during the first part of the menstrual cycle, which is first 4 or 5 days, this sloughing off of the uterus takes place. So they're sloughing off the layer that they just prepared, and then they just build a new layer. Why they need to build a new layer? Because again, they don't know whether in the next cycle that egg will be fertilized or not. So every time the new egg form, the mature egg form, they have to make this inside layer. That innermost layer of the uterus is called endometrium. The middle thickest layer is called a myometrium. Myo means muscle, so that's a smooth muscle layer. And outside the one is called a perimetrium. The uppish region, exactly like the stomach, uppish region of the uterus is called fundus. Remaining part of the uterus is body, and now right here is the cervix. Okay, cervix means the neck. Internal os and external os. The word os means opening. So internal opening, external opening. Now in the side, like when the cervix kind of like go down into the vagina, these two side is known as lateral fornix. In some book, because depending on the cut, this cut is like this way. They're cutting to the coronal section. But if you cut it this way, this some book will refer to the anterior and posterior fornix. To the fornix in the exam, if you write lateral fornix or anterior fornix or posterior fornix, I'll give you full points, because it is a little bit, it's not that impossible to understand, but it's a little bit tricky when you're looking at the picture, that whether you're looking anterior, posterior, or you're looking lateral and medial. So this is lateral, both sides, in this case, and that's the vagina. So that's basically the overall structure of the main reproductive part. And apart from that, there are a little bit external genitalia and the mammary gland that you got to study. Coming back to the uterus one more time, the perimetrium, the external layer, which is external serosa layer. We studied multiple times that one in digestive system as well. Myometrium, that's a smooth muscle layer, extremely like basically that is the main muscle layer that can support the fully grown embryo or fully grown fetus. Endometrium, that's the inner mucosa. Endometrium has two layers, very important. Endometrium has two layers, stratum functionalis, stratum basalis. The word strata means layer. Stratum basalis is the bottom one, stratum functionalis is the top one. So if you go from the perimetrium side, meaning outside to inside, to first perimetrium, then myometrium, then stratum basalis, then stratum functionalis, the topmost layer. Stratum functionalis is the layer that gets sloughed off during the menstrual time. So during the menstruation, that shed off that functionalis layer. Stratum basalis, that's a deep layer behind them, and they stays there. They can help regenerating the stratum functionalis layer. So when he says regenerating, what do they regenerate? They regenerate mainly blood vessels, a lot of glands, because remember, blood is the one who is going to bring the energy and all the material required for embryo to grow. Because the job of an embryo is to grow. And how they grow, when they grow, they need tons of molecules, tons of energy molecules. Those are the ones supplied by the mother's body. So this is the layer. Stratum functionalis is the layer where these things are happening. The growth during each cycle is happening. So there must be a communication between ovary and the uterus, and that communication is done by hormones. There are two very important hormones. One is called estrogen, another one is called progesterone. Both the hormones coming from the ovary telling the uterus, apart from their other job, they're coming from the ovary telling the uterus they have to build a functionalis layer. As soon as that hormone is done, like there is no more estrogen or progesterone, that functional is layer sloughed off, ready for the next cycle. And that's keep continue throughout the reproductive life of a female child, which is approximately begins, let's say, 9 years or 10 years roughly, to the 50 years old, meaning that 40 years of reproductive life, that this is happening every single time. Average days of the cycle is like 28. So anywhere from 21 to 35 days is normal, but 20 days is the average time for this menstrual cycle process. Now, these are the blood vessels that generate. So basically, uterine arteries supply blood to the uterus. So in the uterine artery go there, they produce, it's like a uterus is like a circular structure. So the uterine artery is going through the periphery. They create a radial artery that penetrate the muscle layer. So that's the radial artery. That's radial artery penetrating the muscle layer, going to the endometrium layer. Endometria has two layers, basalis, functionalis. So the bottom one is the basalis layer. The top one is the functionalis layer. In the basalis, this radial artery produce some branches called straight artery. So the straight artery, because they appear straight, so the straight arteries supply the basalis layer. And then the spiral artery, that's like a spiral artery, because they create more over there, the spiral artery supplying the functionalis layer. Now during menses, the spiral artery sheds off. That's why menstrual flow accompanied some blood loss. So the spiral artery from the functionalis layer, that's going to shed off. The straight artery remains there. The spiral arteries to the stratum functionalis lost in the menstrual cycle. Straight arteries supplied to the stratum basalis, they stays there. So every single time, the spiral arteries is the one that's going to grow. Straight artery is the one that's going to stay. So put another picture just to explain that. This is the straight artery in the basalis layer. That's the functionalis layer. So functionalis layer can become very thick. The whole layer goes up, and then they start a second more time, like the next cycle. So the spiral artery, they are the spiral artery, that the one that's going to get lost during the menstrual flow. The mammary gland, the one that I mentioned, it's very important because they are the nourishment for the offspring, because the difference between the function of male reproductive system and female reproductive system, male only produce, maintain, and deliver the gametes. That's their job. Female not only produce, maintains, and mature the gamete, but also they house the fertilization, because fertilization takes place within the female body. Number 3, they help embryo to grow into a fully born, full-grown fetus. And then finally, after the delivery, they take care of the newly born offspring. So they have much more function as far as the reproductive system concerned compared to the male. This is how the structure look like. So for the lab purpose, this is important. So obviously a lot of fat tissue, that's adipose tissue. Then these are lobes of the breast. Individual lobes contains a lot of lobules. So individual lobes contain multiple lobules. It's a three-dimensional structure. So we can see right here in this one lobe, we have 1 and 2. So these are lobules, a tiny one. So 1, 2, 3, 4, those are multiple lobules together makes a lobe. So these are multiple lobules together makes a lobe. And these are the pipeline, these lobules producing the milk under the influence of the hormone called prolactin. We learn in endocrine system chapter. And then this milk is carried by this lactiferous duct. Lactation is formation of the milk. So this lactiferous duct carry them to this open area, a little bit swollen and expanded area we call lactiferous sinus, which brings them back into the nipple. And this is a positive feedback. So as soon as the infant starts sucking the nipple, more milk will be delivered. Hey, this is one example of positive feedback, by the way. So that's the structure you got to study. And then it brings us to our main function. Main thing is how ovary makes the egg. This process is called oogenesis. The process is called oogenesis. Now, the difference between spermatogenesis and oogenesis is multiple, but one very important thing that we got to know. When we learn the formation of the sperm, we just learned how the sperm has been formed in seminiferous tubule. But here, the story is a little bit different. Here, when you're learning how we mature the egg, we not only have to learn the egg, we have to also know that how that mature egg is producing hormones that is controlling the uterus. The story is a little bit more detailed here. So first, let's understand some basic, excuse me, some basic information. So as I mentioned earlier, that egg, being a limited number, is always surrounded by cells. So when there is a one cell layer thick, so that's a tiny one, when there is an egg and one cell layer thick guarding cells are there, those are epithelial cells, they're guarding them, we call those cells follicle cells. When there is a multiple layer of cells guarding the egg, we call those cells granulosa cells. So that's the first thing. Now the second thing to understand, if the egg is surrounded by cells together, that is known as follicle. So when somebody refer to a follicle, they're referring to, when somebody referred to a follicle, so when somebody referring to a follicle, so this is the egg, that's the egg. When there's a guarded by one single layer, we call these cells follicles, follicular cells. When an egg is guarded by multiple layers, so that's one layer, that's second layer, this third layer, multiple layer, these cells we call granulosa cells. But in both cases, the package, when I use the word package, I mean the egg and the guarding cell. This package is called follicle. So follicle means the package, follicle. Different follicle, the beginning one, all the way like at the very small, we call primordial follicle. Then primordial follicle becomes so primordial follicle. Then when they grow, now what did growth means? Growth means if this is the egg and that's the one single cell, this outside cell divide. So the egg becomes like the outside cell become a little bit bigger. We call them primary follicle. And then obviously secondary follicle or so-called growing follicle. So they have like multiple layers now. So the outside cells are divided, not the egg, nothing to do with the egg in this case. Then this is secondary follicle. And then there will be more growth. So they become huge. So this is the egg. And then they're surrounded by multiple layers of cells. And then they become like this big cells with a lot of empty space. This is called Graafian follicle. And then they eject that egg, which comes out along with some layers of cells, and the remaining things we call corpus luteum. This is what we are going to learn right now. So let's go back to the slide mode here. So the tiny one, all the way on the wall, the very tiny one, those are called primordial follicles. Under the influence of hormones, when they keep growing a little bit, we call them primary follicles, slightly bigger. Then they keep growing. This is secondary follicle or growing follicle, So growing follicle finally become huge like this kind of structure. So under the microscope, it's easy, very easy to identify because it has a lot of space here. That space is called antrum. There's a lot of space, fluid-filled space. So this is a humongous structure. The egg is right here. This is called a Graafian follicle. Graafian or vesicular follicle because they create a vesicle. Graafian means ripe. So the follicle is ready to pop. The follicle is ready to undergo ovulation. So what is ovulation? Ovulation is the ejection of that egg. So the egg is coming out along with a couple of layers, like 4 or 5 layers of epithelial cells that we already learned that sperm has to penetrate through those layers. And the remaining structure become like a yellow body. That's what is known as, excuse me, that's what is known as corpus luteum, meaning yellow body. That's how they look like. And then finally, when they die, they produce a scar tissue, sometimes known as corpus albicans. Corpus means body. Albicans is like a white colored scar tissue. So that's what happened to the package. Okay, I'm going to mention this multiple times later on again. So let's go back one more time. The egg is not alone because they are protected in the nature. They're protected by layers of cells. If there's only one layer of cell they're protecting them, we call them follicle cells. Multiple layer protecting them, we call them granulosa cells. Whether they're one layer or multiple layer, the package of cells and those protecting cells together we call follicle. So that's the background knowledge number one. The background knowledge number two, so you can read these things, you can read this, I need this picture to explain. Now this is important. So egg, now the right side of this picture is the follicle, meaning the egg within the package. The yellow color cells are a little bit greenish touch, and those are all follicle cells. The pink is the egg. Now let's look at the left side. This is what happened to the egg. Okay, this is very important to understand. Now, the cells, the stem cell for the oocyte is called oogonium or oogonium. Oogonium is the singular, oogonia is the plural. Same as spermatogonium, spermatogonia, same thing. This happens in a girl child before the birth of the girl child. So when a girl is within their mother's body, when the girl child ovary is just formed during their fetus life, during their fetal developmental time, once the ovary is formed, this begins. So that oogonia undergo mitosis. So when they undergo mitosis, they keep producing more oogonia. So oogonias are under, so one cell become two, two become four, four become eight, and so on. They keep producing. Once they reach to, let's say, million, there's always a debate about the number. So million is a good number to think about. So when they reach to the millions of oogonia, all of them together, this is important to understand, all of them together undergo meiosis. So initially mitosis to reach the number 2 millions. All million of oogonia undergo meiosis at the same time. The first step of meiosis 1 is prophase 1. So one more time, meiosis 1 is prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, cytokinesis. Meiosis 2 will be prophase 2, metaphase 2, anaphase 2, telophase 2, cytokinesis. So the first step of meiosis 1 is prophase 1. So all these oogonia, all 1 million undergo prophase 1 and then they stop. That's it. They go to prophase 1, stop, nothing happens. Child is born, ovary is inactive. So at the time of the birth, all girl child in their ovary, their egg is at prophase 1 stage. One more time, at the time of birth, all the egg in a girl child ovary is at prophase 1 stage. So they are arrested at prophase 1. That's what it says. Arrested in prophase 1, present at birth. Now, in the childhood of that girl child, ovary is inactive. So from the birth to the puberty, ovary is inactive. So during that time, that 1 million prophase 1 stage egg, a lot of them die. So at the end of the childhood, like the beginning of the puberty, maybe 400 to 500,000 survive, which is more than enough. So let's do the mathematics first. As I mentioned earlier, let's say a woman, roughly, just to make the math easy, woman reproductive life is 10 years to 50 years, so 40 years of life. And as I mentioned, the average menstrual cycle is 28 days. We can assume that in a year, a woman will go through 12 menstrual cycles. So in each cycle, if they use, let's say, 5 eggs, so in a year, they're going to use 5 times 12, like 60 eggs. So in 40 years' time, they're going to use like 2,500 eggs, like 2,400 eggs in that. So even if you double it, triple it, still is much lower than 400,000 eggs they have. So although it's a fixed number, but it's a huge number in the ovary. So that's the story number 1. And the second part begins at the beginning of the puberty. At the beginning of the puberty, there's an anterior pituitary release a hormone called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. We know what follicle means already. It's a package, egg, and all these cells guarding the egg. So at the beginning of the puberty, the hormone FSH comes, follicle stimulating hormone. They stimulate the growth of the follicle. So again, the follicle, the package is growing from primary follicle to growing follicle, secondary follicle, or like growing follicle to the Graafian follicle. This is happening. And that takes approximately, they take it to approximately half of the cycle, like day 14. On the other hand, what is happening to the egg? Now remember, egg is what at prophase 1 stage. Remember, the girl child born with the egg, which are arrested at prophase 1 stage. At the time of the first time, like the puberty, when FSH comes in the beginning of each cycle, now that mitomeiosis begin again. So prophase 1 become metaphase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, cytokinesis. Now here comes the most important thing. So from prophase 1, metaphase 1, anaphase 1, cytokinesis. So this is the first cytokinesis. This is the first cytokinesis. When this is happening during that cytokinesis, unequal division of cytoplasm happens. Very different than sperm or any other cell. Unequal, meaning one egg, one cell get almost all the cytoplasm along with the nucleus. The other one just get the nucleus. Just get the half of the DNA, almost no cytoplasm. This is known as first polar body. This first polar body has 2 fates. Either they die right there, they don't survive, or they can undergo meiosis 2 and then die. So basically all polar bodies degenerate anyway. So the first polar body is going to degenerate. So only survival is this part of the cell, which is known as secondary oocyte. So primary oocyte at prophase 1, metaphase 1, telophase 1, anaphase 1, telophase 1, cytokinesis, then secondary oocyte. Only one secondary oocyte because the other one is polar body, they degenerate. Now the secondary oocyte undergo the meiosis 2. Now very important to understand here. Meiosis 2, the first stage is prophase 2. Second stage is metaphase 2. Stop again. Complete stop. So when the secondary oocyte reach at metaphase 2, everything stops. That is the time of ovulation. So when the follicle eject that egg along with some follicular guarding cells that's scooped by the fallopian tube, the egg is at metaphase 2 stage. Now, very important thing, if that egg is fertilized by a sperm, then only the egg is going to complete their meiosis. That is why there is a picture of sperm right there. If the egg is then fertilized by a sperm, then only it's going to go quickly to anaphase, telophase, cytokinesis, produce a second polar body and one functional egg, which is called ovum. So Big difference between the sperm, male and the female is in the male, we have 4 functional sperm at the end of meiosis, 4 functional sperm. In case of egg, we have 1 functional egg at the end of meiosis, because the others, our polar body is going to degenerate anyway. And the metaphase 2 stage egg is not going to complete their meiosis if it is not fertilized by a sperm. They're just going to wash away from the body. So that's the part of the egg. What happened to the right-hand side, the follicle? When the follicle is growing, the first part of the cycle, when the follicle is growing before the ovulation, they release these follicular cells, these follicular cells, the cells on the outside of the egg, they release a very important hormone called estrogen. So when the follicle are growing, means growing follicle are releasing a very important hormone called estrogen. So first, one more time, at the time of the puberty or any other beginning of any other cycle, the hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, comes from the anterior pituitary, initiate this follicular growth, which initiated the meiosis of the egg as well as the follicular growth. Then when the follicle is growing, the growing follicle release estrogen. So estrogen is coming out from the ovary. And then ovulation takes place. This ovulation requires also another hormone called luteinizing hormone, or LH, secreted by pituitary again. So from pituitary, a lot of LH comes, a huge amount of LH. That's why we use the word LH surge. So surge of LH, or a huge amount of LH occur at that time, which is required for ovulation. Once it is ovulated, I'm going to use these slides. So right here, so the primordial follicle become primary follicle, then growing follicle, and then eventually become Graafian follicle. This Graafian follicle is going to release the egg. The Graafian follicle is going to release the egg. One second. This Graafian follicle is going to release the egg. This process is called ovulation. This process is called ovulation. That is where you need the LH. Give me a second. Okay, sorry about that. So one more time. Primordial follicle, when they're growing, because of the FSH, the growing follicle eventually reach to the Graafian follicle. A lot of LH comes, Graafian follicle release the oocyte, comes out at the metaphase 2 stage into the fallopian tube. The remaining structure become corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is 2 hormones. Remember, growing follicle releasing estrogen, but this one releases 2 hormones, mainly principal. One is progesterone and also estrogen. So estrogen has 2 sources. One is the growing follicle before the ovulation and after corpus luteum. But corpus luteum mainly release progesterone, another hormone. Now, both estrogen and progesterone sending a signal to the uterus to make that functionalist layer that we discussed. So the functionalist layer is now fully grown. So even if this egg is fertilized, they will have a nice bed to stay. That process is called implantation, when this fertilized egg is, or the embryo is going to attach with the uterine layer where they can grow into the full-born fetus. If that doesn't happen, this corpus luteum slowly dies, produces corpus albicans. Now, one important thing to remember, this corpus luteum, the lifeline is LH. So when the huge amount of LH comes during ovulation, that LH keeps this corpus luteum active. When LH drops, corpus luteum die together. So LH going down, corpus luteum dying, and the death. Once corpus luteum is dead, means corpus luteum become inactive. No more progesterone, no more estrogen. Sloughing off begins. That's the beginning of the next cycle. So the functionalist layer sloughed off, the new cycle begins again. But if that egg is fertilized, that growing embryo can produce an LH-like hormone, which provide the lifeline of the corpus luteum. As long as corpus luteum is alive, progesterone is there. As long as progesterone is there, functionalist layer is there. That means no more menstrual flow because it's already so-called pregnant. That means no more menstrual flow. Now, the placenta will take over eventually. Then that thing will continue. So nothing, no more menstrual cycle until the end of that process, meaning the childbirth. After the childbirth, again, it's come back and continue the whole process. That is oogenesis. So oogenesis contains like two studies. You have to study the egg, you have to study the follicle as well. So the whole process we can divide into like two main phases with ovulation in the beginning, ovulation in the middle. So in 28 days, if you study the first phase is called follicular phase, where the primordial follicle become primary follicle, then growing follicle become Graafian follicle. Then comes the ovulation. Ovulation occurs when the wall is ruptured, the egg is ejected, and the egg is scooped up by the fallopian tube. And the final phase is luteal phase, where the egg is ejected, the remaining part become corpus luteum. Then the corpus luteum secretes progesterone and estrogen, mainly progesterone. That's the principal one. This is a secondary one. And if pregnancy does not occur, corpus luteum degenerate because LH is dropping, so nothing can protect corpus luteum. When the corpus luteum degenerate, and if every pregnancy occurs, the corpus luteum keep producing until the placenta takes over the role. Why corpus luteum is alive that time? Because growing embryo can release an LH-like hormone. Because remember I said LH is the lifeline for corpus luteum. As long as LH is there, corpus luteum is there. That's basically the whole cycle. This graph will represent all of them very nicely. So the first thing, in the beginning of, so this line, this middle line is day 14. That's the ovulation line. So in the beginning of cycle, 0 to 5 days, that's a menstruation part, meaning the sloughing off taking place. At that time, FSH is coming in the ovary. So the pituitary hormones coming into the blood. So the anterior pituitary release FSH, because the hypothalamus control anterior pituitary release FSH. FSH is coming here, the follicle is growing. When the follicle is growing, they secrete a lot of estrogen. It's like all related. So anterior pituitary release FSH. FSH comes in the, this black line indicate FSH. So FSH is coming in the ovary. The ovary follicle is growing. Ovary follicle is growing. Now, when the follicle is growing, the follicle is releasing estrogen. So estrogen is growing. See that there is no progesterone beginning of the cycle. Then at the time of like day 13, there's a huge LH charge. LH peak triggers ovulation and corpus luteum formation. So the day 13, a lot of LH comes from the pituitary, and then that caused the ovulation. So the egg is ejected, scooped up by the fallopian tube, then the remaining structure become corpus luteum. As soon as they become corpus luteum, they secrete both the hormones, mainly progesterone. Look at the blue line that went up right there, huge amount of progesterone and a little bit of estrogen as well. So estrogen initially a lot, then again a little bit more. But progesterone initially, there is no, after the ovulation, a lot of progesterone. Then slowly LH is dropping. When LH is dropping, corpus luteum is degenerating. When they degenerate, no more progesterone, no more estrogen, the next cycle begins, meaning this huge layer, which is generated in the functionalist layer, that is going to degenerate. So it's like a cyclic process happening every time. So the typical menstruation is like, approximately 28 days. Menstrual phase, the part that accompanied with the blood. Pre-ovulatory phase, we can call the follicular phase as pre-ovulatory phase also, before the ovulation. Ovulation, where the egg is ejected, scooped up by the fallopian tube. That's why sometimes fallopian tube fail to take that ovulated egg. And I'm sure you heard about the word ectopic pregnancy. That means the pregnancy takes place, like the fertilization takes place outside the fallopian tube, because they are not physically connected. The fimbriae, the finger-like structures, are literally swapping the ovary all the time, and it is a vacuum force because of the internal ciliary cells. So the cilia is beating towards the uterus, so they just suck this egg into the fallopian tube, where if the sperm present, they are going to fertilize. I explain these things. Just read basically the menstrual phase, ovulation. There is a video here. I like that video. Whenever you get a chance, this is going to take you to YouTube with some kind of old music also.